Hello ladies, gents, and non-binary mates, and welcome back to Beauty in the Bookcase, where today I'm kind of going to be revisiting / adding on to a video I made, I don't know, 1 or 2 years ago about how the US population aren't really ready to have a Latino-led show. And so I kind of wanted to add on to that and explore kind of like the arguments that some people have against diversity and kind of break those down a bit and try and show things from my perspective. And I also just kind of want to discuss some of the reasons why I personally think that diversity in media is so helpful and important. Now, honestly, I'm not even going to touch the whole like, oh, it's just like woke BS, it's just to like please the snowflake liberal masses argument, because to me that's not an argument. A point that I see very often is regarding like, okay, well, why do we need to have diversity in every show? If it's a show about Vikings, why do we need to have representation if Vikings were all Nordic white people, blah blah blah. I don't know anything about Vikings, so I don't know if that's true. I to an extent can understand that point, you know. I think context and location matter. If your show takes place, I don't know, in like a tiny village in Sweden, then perhaps the diversity levels there are low. According to a quick Google search, the percentage of like black people living in Sweden is less than 1%. So yeah, that's a very understandable statistic, that if you had a show set in, especially if you picked like a very remote, tiny little town, you know, what is the likelihood that the people in the story would look anything other than what you would expect a Swedish person to look like? However, New York is probably one of the most diverse cities in the world. I mean, let's do the comparison, right? Like, how many black people live in New York? 20%. Sure, it's not, you know, 50%, it's not whatever, it's not like the highest percentage, but the truth of the matter is that if you tell a story in a place like New York and every single one of your characters is white, I mean, is that even representative of New York? If you're gonna set your story in a major city that thousands of people go to from all over the world, and you don't have Asian characters, you don't have Middle Eastern characters, you don't have Latino characters. I mean, come on, really, you're gonna set a story in like Miami or New York and not have like a single Latino? I can understand that not every single story contextually needs to have a person of color. But if you set a story in a location and within a context, so like a time period that was full of people of a certain race, then it doesn't make sense for you to just be like, I have an all-white cast, because that's not representative of your location. That's not representative of the context that you're setting your story in. People of color exist. Women exist. And they can lead stories because they have lived through every time period and they have lived in all sorts of places. Because that's the thing, right? We're not often seeing major POC-led shows, right? Not in the mainstream, not that are like wildly successful. There might be a couple of like POC characters, but it's not, wow, every single person on my screen is a person of color and like there's not a single white person around. That's not the majority of media. And then there's an argument that somebody made to me recently that, you know, I was like, I mean, yes, but no, and also this contradicts your point. So I made the mistake of going into a comment section, and it was on Facebook, so you know, it was real good. We were discussing why it was nice that there were more characters that looked like me or that looked like, you know, other people, instead of having just fully white characters. And this person's point was that, you know, oh, well, you don't need to look like a character to relate to them. I don't think anyone's saying I've never related to a single character in my life because they don't look like me, right? Like, I love Captain America and like Spider-Man. I vibe with that kind of like young, naive person who just wants to help people and tries to follow the rules, but sometimes has to break them for the sake of, you know, loyalty to the people that you love. And there's plenty of other, you know, white characters that I relate to. Charlie from Perks of Being a Wallflower, for example. But that's not what people mean when they say, finally, there's a character that I can relate to. The first couple of times that I saw characters that I felt I could relate to on a more personal level, I was already in college, which is like, a problem. The first time I went like, oh my God, that's me. That's my experience. That's what my life, my day-to-day life looks like, was Jane the Virgin and One Day at a Time. So, you know, with Jane the Virgin, it was obviously accessible to me because I grew up watching telenovelas, but it was also like, oh, you know, here is a young Latina. I was in college for creative writing, so, you know, who wants to be a writer, kind of a bookworm, and doesn't fall into like the usual stereotypes that we see of Latinas, right? What I loved was having that dynamic of Jane with her abuela and her mom, seeing a multi-generational home, right? Seeing this close bond with the family. I could see my family reflected. I could see the Spanglish. I could see the having to translate things for family members who don't speak English. And so the second time was One Day at a Time. I remember being floored in that moment. I think I was already doing my master's. I remember this episode, you know, they've just found out that Alex is getting these very racist comments hurled at him, and his sister Elena, who is white passing, she's really frustrated. I mean, she's obviously horrified by the situation, but she's also kind of like, well, that's never happened to me, you know. And the family kind of looks around at each other because Elena is like this very pale girl, and so they're kind of like, well, yeah, obviously you're never gonna experience it. And she's very distraught. Her comment is something about how like she's never gonna like feel oppressed like that, and how frustrating that is. And that, on first thought, or if you don't have the experience, sounds kind of selfish or like weird. It's like, why would you want to be oppressed? But I remember being in college, and my friend Martina and I did a little documentary on campus about race issues, because it was a very white campus, and so we wanted to know, how do people of color feel they are perceived and treated on campus? And we heard a lot of not so great things, and I remember at times feeling like it wasn't my place to advocate because I was super white passing, I have an American accent. I couldn't relate to some of the things that people were saying, and I felt angry that they have to go through them. Angry every time somebody asked me if they could interview me for their diversity project, and the first thing out of their mouths was, yeah, I'm really glad you were available for this, because I didn't want to talk to the other international students because I couldn't understand them. I felt sick to my stomach when people made comments about how they had to switch sides of the street if there was like a black student walking their way because they felt threatened. I remember feeling frustrated that I would never have that experience because I would never understand what it was like to not be perceived as Latina. That sucked. And seeing that on TV and being like, oh, this is something that happens to other people can relate to what I'm feeling, was like earth-shattering to me in the best of ways. I mean, and I think it's hard to see that when everything on TV has already mirrored the way you've grown up. I think it's hard to see why that's important. It's because you've never not had it. So if your argument is, well, you know, it doesn't matter what people look like, I just care about the story, right? Like, or you don't need to look like somebody to relate. Why is it a problem then that there's now people who don't look like you? You can still relate. It's not like these are stories that are like so abstract that they don't have a single universal theme, you know? Like every single story is gonna have universal themes. Family, love, friendship, grief. Like it's gonna have experiences that are accessible to everyone. We've all been to school, we've all had dinner, we've all gone on a first date, we've all had a crush, you know, we've all had an argument with our parents. Because I saw it with, you know, Miss Marvel recently came out, and I saw a lot of people being like, I just can't relate to her character. And I was just like, but why? Because on a very surface level, if you can relate to Spider-Man, who's like a 16-year-old in high school, then you can relate to Kamala, who's also a 16-year-old in high school. And the reason that people are like, well, I can't relate, is why? Because she goes to a mosque? Because of her dynamic with her family? Because what? Because it's a very accessible story, you know? It's very much a story of a kid growing up, being a misfit, not being you know, not really feeling like they belong in their family, and then they find out they have the power. That part's not that relatable. But you know, they have like fights with their friends. We've all fought with our friends, you know what I mean? So why should it not matter to people of color if the person on TV is white, but it does matter to white people if the person on TV is not white, or if the person on TV is a woman, or if the person on TV is gay or trans or whatever. I think one thing people who grew up with everyone on TV looking like them don't understand, it's how damaging subconsciously it can be to have nobody who looks like you. I grew up watching a lot of, Disney Channel. Loved it. And I have, this isn't a criticism of anything about that, but I loved, Miley Cyrus, and I loved Hilary Duff and Ally and AJ. Those were like my top. Pixel Perfect, that was like my favorite movie. But I remember being a kid and looking at myself in the mirror and thinking, oh, when I'm older, I'm gonna dye my hair blonde, and I'm gonna get blue eye contacts, and I'm gonna get my nose I'm gonna get nose surgery to make it smaller. And at that point, slightly bigger lips were not in. I remember I would tuck my top lip in and then smile and try to keep it in so that it would look thinner. I remember then continuing to grow up and developing this body and being like, I don't look like these girls on TV, and feeling really shit about myself. And I don't know if you've ever been, an 8 or a 10-year-old who looks at yourself in the mirror and every single time you just look at yourself, you're like, I want to change everything about me. But like that shit stays with you. And I'm not blaming Disney Channel for that. I'm not saying, oh, it's Ally and AJ's fault. I'm not saying it's Hilary Duff's fault. But I'm saying that's all I was seeing. So I thought in my mind, if I found them beautiful. So I thought, well, if I want to be beautiful, then I need to look like them. That's it. Because that's all that's on TV. And the thing is, I know that's not an isolated issue. I think a lot of people, even when you do grow up seeing people like you, right? I think a lot of the times when we have Black characters, they're not always allowed to have their natural hair. As a kid, what message does that, give you? To me, that would say, oh, well, curls aren't pretty. Because that was another thing. I straightened my hair all the time when I was younger, because I was conditioned to believe, not just by the media, it was a social thing as well, that I looked prettier with straight hair. I don't want to say that you can't critique a show because that's dumb. I think there is a level of validity when it comes to criticism, and that is not saying, I need to agree with you or your opinion isn't valid. That's not what I'm getting at. A valid criticism can be characterization. It can be about plot. It can be about like inconsistencies with like location or time period. It can be about pacing. Like, let's take, for example, I was watching The Umbrella Academy recently. I love The Umbrella Academy. And, there were a lot of people who weren't exactly thrilled with the plot. They thought that the season was kind of weak, and they had different opinions, and I agreed with some, I didn't agree with others, and that's fine. That said, if you say, well, I didn't like this season of The Umbrella Academy because I hate that Vanya is now Victor, why couldn't Elliot Page just do his job and act? But yeah, if you say, I think it sucked because I don't like that, Vanya's now Victor, I wouldn't say that that's a valid criticism, because you're not saying anything about the character. You're criticizing Elliot Page at that point for being trans. I don't like that Victor seemed to put Harlan above everyone else. Valid criticism. I don't like that Victor tried to feel like he was the leader of the group. Those are opinions, because there you're judging the character instead of just being like, well, I don't like that Elliot Page is trans. And I don't like that they forced that into the show, because I don't want to be forced that woke bullshit or whatever. And it's the same, right? If we go to Miss Marvel, if your criticism is, I found that the pacing was off. Maybe you found that the pacing was a little bit slow. I didn't like that there wasn't as much action as Marvel's usual stuff. I didn't like that there was more of a focus on like the coming of age aspect of it than her powers. Sure. If your criticisms are, I don't like that I had to watch, that wedding scene. I don't like that her religion and her, ethnicity play such a big role. That's not a valid criticism. And here's why. People want to be like, well, your race, your religion, or your like sexuality aren't like everything, they're not, it shouldn't be your whole personality, obviously. But the thing is, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, we're all very much influenced by where we grew up, how we grew up, if we practice a religion or not. Like, we just are. It is fundamental to our character. because we are the people who we are because of all of these circumstances. So saying, well, take out all of the religious stuff, take out all of the cultural stuff is stupid. Because sure, it's not everything, in this case, Kamala, it's not all she is. But obviously, if you grow up in a certain environment and if you grow up in a certain structure, do you not think that that's going to affect who you are as a person? And that's not just, a fiction thing. That is just a people thing. Like, people are who they are because of their environment. So I think getting mad about it and saying like, well, this shouldn't even be part of it because that's not how it works. Actually, it is exactly how it works. And that kind of brings us back, right, to like, well, I just care about the story. I don't care about the character. I don't care about their background. I just want a good story. Why can't a story be both inclusive and good? I do, like, yes, I think the story is obviously the most important part. Duh. Nobody watches something with a bad plot line unless you're making fun of it. But you know what I mean. Why are you equating having people of color leads with bad stories? Because, sure, there have been some abysmal shows out there with all sorts of people leading them. But then again, that's not on the actors, that's on the writing. And so I have two last points, really, which are the stop altering characters, like existing characters camp, and then the make your own characters camp. And I want to dive into how those two things constantly clash in a way that basically says don't have diverse people on TV. So what do I mean when I talk about the people who are like, okay, stop taking characters that already exist and like making them Black, a woman, queer, whatever. I understand that it can be frustrating, right? If there's a character that you really love and that has had a long history of existing and suddenly they switch that up. I can understand that frustration because, as we discussed earlier, the way you're brought up and your background affects who you are. So if you try to force the original character's entire personality into a character that looks different and will have different interactions with people around them to an extent, but is also still trying to be that character, that can be really like messy and complicated and just not great. And you grow attached to these characters and it's hard to see them become somebody else because then it feels like they're trying to shove two people into one body almost. But then I think there's a way to do it that still causes issues, Like, I can think of Miles Morales, right? There are some people out there who don't think that Miles should be called Spider-Man because Spider-Man has always been Peter Parker and Peter Parker has always been white, and therefore Miles should have a different name because he's not Spider-Man, because he's not white. And the thing is, Miles's character is very different from Peter. But even then, people are like, well, no, because that's not Spider-Man. Spider-Man is only Peter Parker. And the thing is, because you've grown up with every Spider-Man looking like you don't know how much Miles means to so many people. I remember going to Comic-Con and seeing all these guys. There were like a bajillion Spider-Man, but I remember also seeing a lot of guys dressed up as Miles, and that moment was pivotal to me, because I was like, this is who that's all for. It's for all these guys who grew up here, darker skin, mixed, and who felt like, well, I can't be a superhero, I can't be Spider-Man, or were even told like, well, you can't be Spider-Man because Spider-Man's white. And it's like, but now he's not, because Miles isn't. It's for people who have always related to these characters to be able to be like, oh, well, I can be that too, because now I look like them, and now some of their experiences are like mine. You're allowed to not enjoy something, you're allowed to not watch something, but you don't have to go on the internet and make a fuss about it and then say like, well, I don't think he should be called Spider-Man because Spider-Man is white and he should be like the Black Spider or something. And that shit is impacting, and for all the reasons that I mentioned before, and it might not make sense to you because you've grown up in a world where everyone has always looked like you, so nobody's ever told you, you can't be Spider-Man, you can't be this, you can't be... When I was in college, I had people who told me that I shouldn't even try to be a writer because I was A, a woman, and B, Hispanic, so nobody cared about what I had to say. But guess what? Jane the Virgin, she did it. And of course, there's obviously other real life authors that have inspired me, but yeah, you see that and you go, well, she's a woman and she's Hispanic because she wrote a book. But then there's the other camp, which is the make your own. Let's make our own characters. Now, I'm going to use sitcoms for this example because it's where I have seen it criminally happen the most. And that said, I think sitcoms are like the most canceled genre of TV ever. Aside from Jane the Virgin, or shows that portray Hispanic people as either housekeepers or drug dealers or like in some type of gang activity or living in the ghetto. I have seen a whole lot more of Latino shows and Black shows, and then this is speaking about the sitcoms that I've watched, get canceled before white-led shows. And that's not to say that white-led shows don't get canceled. There have been plenty of shows that have had white leads that I have enjoyed and they canceled. This goes back to that first video that I made. I think it was around the time when like Broke and One Day at a Time got canceled. But when you went into the reviews, all the negative reviews were saying, well, I don't like this show because I don't like that it has subtitles. I don't like that they speak Spanish. I want to watch a show, not read it. A lot of the issues that people were having and a lot of the reasons why they decided to stop watching or not watch at all was because they couldn't be bothered to read a couple of lines of text once in a while to enjoy the show. And the thing is, this happens all the time with Latino shows. But the thing is, that's how we live realistically. Like, Latino families speak Spanglish all the time. Or you will have a tío or your abuela or your sister or whatever who either doesn't speak English or doesn't like speaking English. And especially if you're in your home, you're gonna talk your native language. And that bothers people, but I'm like, well, that's how it is, And this goes back to relatability. The thing is that I could give you the exact same show, the exact same plot line, with 3 different concepts, and 2 of them would get canceled and 1 of them might have a chance. Here's the basic concept of the show. A woman who's a single mother gets fired from her job, and she is obviously distraught and trying to figure out what to do. Okay, Latino-led show. When she gets out of the office, she's crying in her car. She calls her mom and explains the situation to her in Spanish, or her mom kind of gives her advice in Spanish. There's subtitles. I don't like that. Canceled. I'm not reading a show. Same plot. Muslim character. They get fired. They decide to go speak to a religious figure from their community. Go to them for advice. What do I do? Because I have these kids at home. And there's religious allusions to it. Canceled. A white woman is fired. Goes to her car. Calls her mom. Her mom comforts her in English. Not a problem. I haven't had to read anything. Keeps driving. Goes to the community center or the local church. Speaks to a priest. Got canceled. Do you understand what I'm saying? The thing is that I can give you a universal plot line and I will see the same exact criticisms for Latino shows, for Black shows, for Muslim shows, for Middle Eastern shows, Asian shows. It's like, well, their subtitles or like their religion or like too much culture or whatever. But it's the exact same plot line, right? Diverse elements are around the story, but the story is a universal story of, man, it sucks to lose your job when you have kids. That would be awful. So the thing is, we can't take existing characters because y'all get mad. But then we also can't make our own characters because the shows get canceled because nobody, who doesn't belong to those groups wants to watch it because you don't want to have to read a freaking subtitle for 2 minutes. Not even a couple seconds. Because you don't want to hear somebody speaking a different language because you don't want to see somebody eating something that isn't like spaghetti or, a roast or whatever. So then we can't win. You do not give us this space to do anything other than force diversity because we have to just deal with accepting a tiny role as like the best friend or whatever, the quirky neighbor or something, because we can't have a show that stars us because it's not gonna make it. And we can't take your characters, so you're gonna get mad. And again, I'm not saying that you have to like it. You don't have to watch it. Nobody's sure, I am just saying viewership is low for these shows. But the thing is, I don't think I've ever had such a viscerally negative reaction to a TV show or a movie or a book that isn't like based on plot or like, pacing or whatever, where I felt the need to go and talk trash about it online. I don't think I've ever read like the first few pages of a book or watched the first 2 episodes of a show and then been like, this is garbage. First of all, I have tortured myself watching through things that I don't enjoy, reading books that I haven't enjoyed, because if I want to talk about it, I want to make sure that I have the whole context of it, not just kind of like, okay, well, 2 episodes, I don't know, first few chapters, I don't know what happens later. I don't know if it gets better. I don't know if it gets worse. Other than to just show off like, your blatant racism or homophobia, transphobia, sexism, whatever. What's the need to go online and write a giant paragraph about why you think something is shit, but not because of, you know, an actual reason that can be easily fixed, like, you know, with plot, but because you don't like that somebody on TV doesn't look like you, or doesn't talk like you, or lives their life differently from you. At the end of the day, know that the whole point of doing that is to try and persuade companies to stop being afraid of the woke mob and stop trying to please these snowflakes or whatever. But the thing is, all these things are not for you. You don't need to watch them. They're not going to affect you because everything else that already exists is for you, benefits you, reflects you. The new stuff coming out, the stuff that's for us, is there for us. It's there so that little kids can feel that they can be superheroes. It's there so that girls don't feel that they need to look a certain way to be pretty. It's there for people to be able to say, hey, I experienced this too. And if anyone out there has had this experience, I want you to know that it happens to other people. And you know, you might be like, oh, well, isn't it ironic that you're saying, well, that I shouldn't go and make like a paragraph and a half about how much I hate a TV show when you're here criticizing me on the internet? You can write your paragraphs. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But what I'm saying is, I am not going to consider your criticism valid if it's not about the actual show, if it's not about the actual plot, if it's not about the actual movie. If your criticism is, I don't like that there's Black people in the show, I don't like that there's Latinos on the show, I don't like that there are different religions on the show, I don't like that there's gay people on the show, I don't like that there's trans people on the show, that is not a valid criticism. You are not critiquing the show. You are critiquing people for who they are. I'm not here trying to change anyone's mind because I know how people are. And I know I'm not going to change the minds of people who have already made up their minds that diversity is the end of modern society or whatever. I am making this, first of all, to get all these thoughts out because they've been bothering me for a while now, but also so that people who have had this experience of not being able to see themselves on TV until they were adults, or people who have benefited from seeing themselves, or people who have had to overcome self-hatred and self-esteem issues because nobody on TV looked like them, so that they can know that this is a space to talk about it. So that was a more serious video than usual. Well, I don't know, sometimes I talk about some dark stuff here. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked it, make sure to leave a like, make sure to subscribe. I mostly make videos about books and languages, but sometimes I also just yell into the void because I need to put my feelings somewhere. So subscribe for whatever is next from me. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss a video, and I will see you all next time.